In the Halo universe, there is one undeniable fact, that the Spartans won the war against the Covenant. Right? Well, that's what I'm going to attempt to answer today. This video is going to be a little bit more argumentative than my regular videos are, a little bit more opinionated than my videos already are, and while I'm staying within the confines of verifiable fact, since this is a bit of a hot topic, you may or may not agree with the conclusion of this video, but I would love to hear your points in the comments below. I won't think any less of you for disagreeing, and I hope you have the same mindset. In addition to that, I've also asked the Discord and the Patreon if they think Spartans won the war and their perspectives on the issue, and I'm going to go over some of those in this video as well. Now, in this video, we're going to go over what the Spartans actually did, how that affected the war, and ultimately, hopefully, come to a conclusion on whether or not they did in fact win the war, as so many people, both in-universe and out-of-universe, claim they did. For this video, we'll mainly be looking at the Spartan 2s, but we will also have a look at the Spartan 3s and their efforts to slow down the Covenant. However, as I'm sure you're aware, the Spartan 4 program didn't really take off until the end of the war with the Covenant. However, there were some Spartan 4s at the very end of the war. It's dicey, but technically they were there, and while the Spartan 4's contribution to humanity's security in the post-war galaxy is immeasurable, they will sort of be excluded from this video. I think the best way to do this is by simply going over what the Spartans did in the beginning, late middle, and then end of the war, and then dive into the events that saw the war ending and the key players of those events. Now, this is not a history of Spartans video. Much better YouTubers than I have done that. Today we just want to answer the question, did Spartans really win the war? And we're going to start off with the numbers problem. So far, there have been a total of 38 Spartan 2s, many of which spend a lot of time in cryosleep and not fighting for a good portion of the war. That just comes from space travel. It takes a long time to get places, and so they can't be where the Covenant is at all times. When it comes to Spartan 3s, both Alpha Company and Beta Companies had 300 Spartans each. Gamma Company had 330. However, for this video's topic, it would be inaccurate to say that there were 930 Spartan 3s that impacted the war. The Gammas basically only had just left Onyx when the war ended, and so for this topic we'll be only looking at Alpha Company and Beta Company, totaling about 600 Spartans. Technically there are more or fewer. Ghosts of Onyx doesn't really tell us exactly how many Spartan 3s there were in each. They say 300 each, but then they go on to say that there were 300 who die in Prometheus and 298 that die in Torpedo, but we know that cannot be true based on Halo Reach and those Spartan 3s, so it's not 100% clear how many there were, but we're going to operate on 600 Spartan 3s influencing the war, which gives us a total of 638 Spartans that actually fought the Covenant throughout the war. Really, no matter what, when we are talking about billions of fighters and billions of casualties, 638 Spartans just can't be everywhere. And so I think it's really important to say, while Spartans were incredible and certainly extended the war, as we'll talk about, there was never enough of them to make a real difference for most battles in most planets. Typically, when a Spartan got planetside and they were actually able to fight, they were actually able to beat the Covenant, push the Covenant back, and stall them from retrieving whatever they wanted to get. Most of the time, this was Forerunner artifacts. The unfortunate part is that, like we've been discussing, this is an interstellar galactic war spanning an incomprehensible area. And so sometimes Spartans could not get to a planet on time. Sometimes when they did get there on time, they couldn't beat the Covenant back. And almost every time, the planet was lost anyway. If we pair that with the fact that the Spartans did little to nothing in naval combat, most of the time, there are exceptions, we really start to get the picture that for most battles, the Spartans just couldn't make any impact at all. They were a boots-on-the-ground unit, and if a battle was happening in space, as was very, very common, the Spartans had minimal impact, with some exceptions, again, which we'll talk about here in a minute. If they were given the tools that they needed and the go-ahead, they could outright end naval engagements. But as John says in The Fall of Reach, when he talks about how he hates being in ships in combat, most of the time they could couldn't do anything. They were either awake and letting the bridge crew do their thing, which was a real challenge for him since they are men and women of action, or they were in cryosleep and had no idea a battle was even happening in the first place. Like I said, there are exceptions. When the crews were critically low, like in Halo First Strike, we see Spartans starting to man the bridge stations. And in the Fall of Reach and Silent Storm, we see them taking nukes into Covenant ships and blowing them up from the inside, something that they would do quite a bit in the early stages of the war. And in Halo Legends, we see them actually infiltrate a Covenant ship using these special vehicles. So we have examples of them influencing naval combat, but again, it's a galaxy-wide war, and they couldn't be everywhere at once with such few numbers. The 2520s, really from 2525 on, there is a ton of uncertainty. Humanity had just been attacked by an alien force that we knew basically nothing about. We didn't know why they were attacking us, what their ultimate goal was, who their leaders were, and how their command was structured. The list is almost endless as to what we didn't know, but one thing was made clear from the very beginning. From the Spartans' very first encounter with them, they could be killed. The Covenant could be killed. Samuel's sacrifice was a lesson to all the Spartans that the Covenant was not invincible. They were not immortal. They could be wounded, they could be killed, but the price would always be exceedingly high. Now, in the early war, the Spartans were critical. The rest of the UNSC and some remnants of the CMA at this point were getting slaughtered. Naval combat was basically a wash, and ground fighting didn't really matter when the Covenant could just start glassing if you pushed them far enough. There were some rays of sunshine, though, don't get me wrong. There were rare victories, like in early 2526, where Admiral Cole led the largest human fleet ever created in history to victory over one Covenant ship, losing 13 ships in the process. But did you know that this battle doesn't end in a victory without the Spartans? Without a single Spartan there, the Spartans are the reason that this is a victory. A few months prior to this, the Spartans had their first encounter with the Covenant when Samuel died, like I talked about here a couple minutes ago, and the intelligence from that encounter gave Cole what he needed. He knew from the report from the Spartans that Covenant energy shielding dropped around their ship's guns when they fired, and by concentrating on those areas, Cole was victorious. Which brings us to a really great point. Even though at this time the Spartans were super classified and very few knew of their existence, the intelligence gathered from their encounters on the Covenant was invaluable to the rest of the species. And without the Spartans gathering intelligence, the war could have been much shorter and much more devastating. In these early years of the war, the Spartans did some very, very important things, and were really the only method of fighting the Covenant without losing a dozen plus ships at any time. So the Spartans were used in various ways, but one of the more common ways that they were used was very similar to their first encounter with the Covenant. They'd strap nukes to themselves, jump out into space, then board and blow up Covenant ships. Then there were missions like Operation Silent Storm, where the Spartans attacked and blew up entire Covenant cities and entire Covenant holy sites. On a planet called Zois, the Spartans nuked Covenant cities and holy sites, both in orbit and on the ground. This was a huge blow to the Covenant, and the reason I bring this up is to determine whether or not this even mattered in the end. The Spartans were successful in striking the Covenant at their home, for lack of a better term, but did this really slow them down? Did this really hurt them? In some ways, yes, but the Covenant was so massive, so numerous, that this was merely a chink in the armor, and this is something that we'd see time and time again, where we would have a great victory to us, but was it really a great loss to the Covenant? Am I too dark? I might be too dark. Well, tell me what you think about the look in this video. I don't know. Like, I dialed in my camera way more than I ever have. And so visually, I think I look much better. But do I look better in a lighting sense? Tell me. Let me know. The Spartans also did smaller missions in this time period, but like the events that we've already discussed, they were big deals to humanity and small blows to the Covenant, all while the Covenant was steadily moving ever closer and ever further into human-controlled space and glassing colonies as they went, which this really goes back to the numbers problem. At this point in time, there are less than 40 Spartans in existence, and in a war that spans light years with casualties numbered in the billions, it simply is impossible for them to be everywhere at once, defending every planet, and even if they could do such a thing, teleport from place to place, there were never enough of them to hold the Covenant back in any meaningful way. And even when they were victorious against the Covenant, plasma would start raining down from the sky anyway. And so it just didn't matter. In a war for survival, it doesn't matter if you push them back and they glass anyway. However, there was one elite in this time period that thought the Spartans were the greatest threat to the Covenant. An elite named Human-Coveanant. You've probably heard me speak his name before and speak about him, but he was a fleet master and was one to feel the wrath of the Spartans in Silent Storm, which led him to beg the prophets to allow him to track down Oni and the Spartans and kill them. But to do so, he'd need an extremely valuable artifact, a Forerunner luminal beacon. It's basically a Forerunner tracking device, but the Covenant only had 2 of them, one was already lost, and to get this, the Fleet Master and his loyal elites went rogue. They killed On High Charity and stole the luminal beacon. They then set out to track the Spartans and Oni down. Now this plan doesn't work, and the elites are stranded by the Covenant on a desert planet as punishment for this, but it does show that the Spartans were such a threat that an elite would risk life, limb, and honor to bring them down. In the early years of the 2530s, we see some pretty major Spartan victories that would actually come to help humanity survive. The biggest one being Red Team and Sergeant Forge stopping the Covenant from obtaining a Forerunner fleet inside of a shield world known as Trove. If the Covenant actually got their hands on these ships, it is entirely possible that the war ends much more quickly with a Covenant victory. Arguably, the most important thing to happen in the early stages of the 2300s was the green light for the Spartan 3 program. If you watched my Oni breakdown video, you'll know exactly how this went down, so I'm not going to go into huge detail here, but more Spartans were on the way. The first half of the decade the first half of the decade was really a war on 2 fronts. While the Spartans were undoubtedly still fighting the Covenant, we don't know much about what they were doing, so I can't really talk about it. But in addition to that, they were also fighting the insurrection as well. And since this video is about the Human-Covenant War, I'm not going to talk about it here either. So, while the lore here is pretty dry, and that will continue into the 2540s, we do know that they were still fighting the Covenant, as seen in the opening pages of The Fall of Reach, where Blue Team kills a ton of grunts, but again, it just doesn't really matter, as the planet is glassed anyway. This is Jericho 7. However, in 2535, we get to the Rubble, where Spartan Grey Team is working to enforce the Cole Protocol from anti-Earth humans who were playing with the idea of selling out Earth, something that Grey Team was ultimately successful in doing, further extending the war. If the Covenant found Earth, we're kind of cooked. In June of 2536, the Spartan 3s of Alpha Company graduated. As we all know, the Spartan 3s were created to trade lives for time. Their entire purpose was to extend the war, to buy the UNSC time to develop technologies and plans to actually put up a fight for humanity, which leads us nicely into Operation Prometheus, where most of Alpha Company attacks a Covenant shipyard that was very close to human space. This ends in the shipyard being inoperable, but every single Spartan 3 deployed here was killed. While that sounds really bad, that 300 Spartan 3s were killed here, this mission was viewed as a success in the eyes of the United Nations Space Command and the Office of Naval Intelligence's leadership. The Spartans successfully took a shipyard out of service, which undeniably slowed the Covenant's invasion into human-controlled space. But with Alpha Company destroyed, save but a very precious few, Beta Company had to be created, and in 2537 it was greenlit, and training would start in 2539. In the 2530s, many human colonies were attacked. New Constantinople, New Harmony, Boundary, Coho, Charybdis 9, the list goes on, and there weren't enough Spartans to defend every planet, and in many of these conflicts, the Spartans were either not there or just too late. Just need to jump in here for a second and say thank you to all of my Patreon supporters. You guys are the best. And if you haven't considered it, please consider it. It's pretty cool. You get like this poster here. A pretty cool poster. I had an artist make it. She's great. Also, at the time that this video comes out on YouTube, the history's first ever Halo Campaign Evolved Lasso run is on the Patreon now. So you can see that early. It'll also be here it'll be here too, but you know. Okay, love you. Now the 40s get pretty tough, just like the beginning of the 2530s. We don't have very much information. We have thing happened on X planet X planet is attacked by X force. The Spartans may have been there, they may not have been, but the planet was glassed anyway. We see this time and time again in the 40s. It's probably the decade of the Human-Covenant War with the least amount of lore in it, but there is some good information in the later years of the 2540s that pertain to this video's topic. And just to point something out, if you have an early edition of The Fall of Reach, there is a lot of dates that are wrong. There's a mistake in the book. If it reads 2542, it actually happened in 2552. Which is an unfortunate mistake, but it's been corrected in later editions. My editions still have the 2542 issue in them. As I've said, this decade is exceedingly dry when it comes to pretty much everything, to be totally honest with you, but especially when it comes to the Spartans. However, in 2544, there is something that actually may have had a significant impact on the war if the prophets actually ended up caring about it, or caring about their underlings. Spartan Cow 141 was involved in the assassination of a minor prophet. While she wasn't the one to pull the trigger, there's no denying that this prophet would not have been killed without her. Did this actually change the war? That's debatable. I really don't think so. In 2545, Draco 3 is invaded by the Covenant, and it's sort of an odd case. Here the civilians were hunted down for sport by the vicious races of the Covenant, and many of them were eaten alive. Spartan 2s were deployed here after seeing the Waypoint vids and Oni briefings on what the Covenant was doing here, and while they were too late to save the civilians, they did at least avenge them, and by all accounts it was a bloodbath. But it didn't help the war effort in any meaningful way. I think you're probably starting to see a theme here. Also in 2545, the Spartan 3s of Beta Company were sent to Bagasse Delta for Operation Torpedo. Here they were able to disable a Covenant fuel refinery, but just like Alpha Company, they were all killed except for two, Tom and Lucy. Again, like Alpha Company, it's undeniable that this slowed the Covenant's advance into human-controlled space. We can't be totally sure how much this slowed the Covenant's advance, but it must have in some way for Oni to decide to sacrifice 300 Spartans for it. In 2547, the Spartans actually were able to make a significant difference, and it wasn't even their fault. If you have seen my Oni breakdown video, you'll know that the Spartans were declassified and made public in 2547 by Oni Section 2. This actually is a pretty significant development by all accounts. The mere mention of human soldiers taking the fight to the Covenant, living heroes, gave the UNSC a boost in morale that was unmatched throughout the war. And while morale isn't a quantifiable thing that we can measure, it does play a massive part in warfare. So it is possible that this, while the Spartans didn't really have anything to do with it, may have made the others of the UNSC fight harder for longer and may have extended the war in a significant way. Like the 2530s and 2520s, there were several human colonies that were glassed in this decade. Many that remain unnamed, but there were colonies like Camber, like New Lanelli, like Sansar, Bounty, Meridian, and many, many more that were attacked and glassed by the Covenant that the Spartans may or may not have had a hand in. Now we're going to get into the good stuff, the stuff that actually ended the war. And as we get into this, I want you to keep in mind four key figures here: Cortana, the Master Chief, the Prophet of Regret, and the Arbiter. Because I think the war ending can be attributed to four beings of equal value, and I think that the war's end can be traced back to one event, and this event set the foundation for what would eventually lead to the war's end, and that is Ensign Lovell realizing that the Covenant was coming to Sigma Octanus 4. For those of you who have not read The Fall of Reach, Ensign Lovell was a slipspace probe operator. They would send probes into slipspace, they would do a series of scans, drop out of slipspace, and then they would go out and retrieve them after the fact, then look through the data. This was sort of a early warning system for a Covenant invasion. Ensign Lovell saw something that he thought may have been the Covenant, so he sent it to basically the only ship in the system, the Iroquois. Its commander, Jacob Keyes, looked over this report, and he had just read a report from a Spartan 2 washout named Fahajad that had become a slipspace expert. Fahajad theorized that if multiple objects are in close proximity to each other in slipspace, to a slipspace probe, they can appear as one massive object, rather than a series of smaller objects. With this new information, well, it's not really new, it came out 8 or 9 years before this happened, but Keyes had just read it, and so it was sort of fresh in his mind, new information to him. Keyes looked over Lovell's findings to realize that the Covenant was on its way. Now, I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail here. I've covered this many times in shorts, but Keyes was effectively alone in the system and called for help. Before help could arrive, however, the Covenant dropped out of slipspace, and this was when Keyes would perform the legendary Keyes loop, which I've made several videos about. If you'd like to see them, I'll link them in the description below. It might also be like up here or something, or maybe up here. I don't know. For a YouTuber, I'm not good at YouTube. The end result, however, of the Keyes loop was voice crack. The end result of the Keyes loop, however, was three very important things. The first one was being most of the Covenant ships being destroyed except for one. That one fled. The Covenant ship that did flee deployed ground troops to the planet, and finally the Spartans were called to this planet to fight those ground troops and really nuke a city. That was their goal. When the Spartans got there, a battle was brewing in space, and the Spartans were sent, again, like I said, to basically nuke Côte d'Azur, a city. However, when they got to the city, they realized that the Covenant had taken control of a human natural history museum. This was odd to the Spartans since they never observed the Covenant caring about human history, so why would they be at this museum? They went inside and they find that the Covenant was interested in one particular object, something that looked like a granite stone with rubies inlaid in it. The Spartans took it and fled, nuked the city, and above them in space was a human victory, actually. The humans used a massive ship called the Cradle sort of as a shield to block the Covenant attacks, and then it would turn like this, and then the UNSC ships would shoot Mac rounds at the Covenant. When the Covenant was ready to attack again, that ship blocked them again. In the aftermath of the battle, the commander of the Iroquois was promoted to captain, but his ship was bugged. Hidden in the debris field of the battle was a Covenant relay probe. This is a very small device that over time is able to slowly charge up a slipspace capacitor, and while doing so, record location data. When it has the data it needs, it is able to shoot a data crystal into slipspace, and the Covenant can recover it when it falls out of slipspace wherever it does, usually a predetermined location. This relay probe attached itself to the Iroquois. The Spartans and the Iroquois would then return to Reach for Operation Red Flag. Operation Red Flag was a daring and, in my opinion, suicidal mission. The Spartans would take the Pillar of Autumn, captained by Captain Keyes, out to Covenant space. They would steal a Covenant ship, something they had never been successful in doing so at this point, and take that Covenant ship to the Covenant's home planet. They didn't know about High Charity, kidnap a prophet. They didn't know what a prophet was, or what they looked like, or what their guard was, and try to leverage their captured prophet and sue for peace. They did not know that any one of the prophets would have been more than happy to let the others die. But since this plan called for Keyes to captain the Pillar of Autumn, the relay probe on the Iroquois came to Reach and alerted the Covenant to its location. When the Spartans got to Reach, they gave the artifact that they found in that museum to Oni, who gave it to Catherine Halsey, who had Cortana take a look at it. And with the data found in that Forerunner artifact, as well as the data that was being mined from the Forerunner ship buried in the ice, Cortana found a location. She had no idea what this location was or its significance, and on August 30th, 2552, the Pillar of Autumn left to go on Operation Red Flag. Again, I'm not going to go into great detail here, but they'd have to turn around when news of a Covenant invasion reached them. The Master Chief, Linda, and James were ordered to go to Gamma Station to clear an Oni ship's navigational data. The rest of the Spartans were to go groundside to defend the ground generators that were powering the orbital MAC stations above. The Master Chief's mission was successful, but Linda and James were killed. James was sent out into space, and Linda was shot several times with plasma. Her heart stopped beating, but the Chief was able to get her back to the Autumn and shove her into a cryopod. He couldn't raise his other Spartans on comms, and the Pillar of Autumn basically was the last ship in the system, so they left. They ran. The Pillar of Autumn jumped into slipspace. Keyes put Cortana in charge of this operation, and so she did something peculiar. In accordance to the Cole Protocol, she had to pick a random location, but random doesn't mean, throwing a dart at a map. It just means picking a location that did not lead to Earth or one of her colonies. Well, she just cracked this Forerunner code that led somewhere. She might as well discover where it went, and this led to Alpha Halo. Now, we know how this turns out, but putting it within the context of the war ending, the destruction of Alpha Halo was a massive event. It was probably the most devastating blow to the Covenant in their entire 3,000-year history. For literally 3,000 years, the Covenant searched for sacred rings, and when they finally found one, it was destroyed 3 days later, leading to the creation of an Arbiter. A really big deal, as we'll come to discover. The destruction of Alpha Halo would start the beginning of the end. Because of the destruction of Alpha Halo at the hands of a Spartan, I should add, the Supreme Commander of the Fleet of Particular Justice would be branded a heretic and sentenced to death. This would end up in him becoming an Arbiter of the Covenant, where he would be sent to a gas mining facility on Threshold to meet Sesa Refami, an elite that met with an oracle, as the Covenant would call it, 343 Guilty Spark. Spark opened Sesa's eyes, and he would be the first to sort of plant the seed of doubt in the Arbiter's head that just maybe the prophets didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know what they were preaching about. They didn't know everything. Maybe the prophets could be fallible. Unrelated to all of this, the Prophet of Regret's fleet would find a luminary on a moon of Meridian, and that would send him to Earth, the closest portal location to the Ark. When they got there, they met strong resistance, so instead of going to the Ark, they decided to jump to a halo, Delta Halo, where a human ship would follow. Of course, as you all know, this was a fatal mistake for the Prophet. The Master Chief, when getting to the halo, would hunt him down, and as he was closing in on the Prophet, High Charity would arrive. Immediately, dozens, maybe even hundreds of ships would deploy from High Charity to the ring to try to save the Prophet, but something curious happened here. We learn of this in Broken Circle, that the Prophet of Truth ordered those ships to return, basically sealing the fate of Regret. And the Chief would kill him. And in response, Truth would make the Brutes the protectors of the Prophets, and the Great Schism would start. So a Spartan's very, very important in these events. From here, as I'm sure you're all aware, the elites would flip on the Covenant, some going in their own direction, but many joining humanity to fight to end the war. They'd go to Earth to help in its defense, even glassing a portion of Africa to cleanse the flood. They'd go to the Ark, where together the Master Chief and the Arbiter would put the Covenant down forever, while remnants would pop up here and there, and some of them would be really, really powerful. The Covenant as we knew it ended here. But without Cortana, Alpha Halo would not have been destroyed by the Master Chief, and the Chief wouldn't have made it back to Reach, or Earth, and he wouldn't have been able to get through High Charity. Without the Chief, Alpha Halo wouldn't have been destroyed, Regret wouldn't have been killed, Thel wouldn't have been made an Arbiter, so on and so on. Without Truth, the Great Schism wouldn't have started, and the elites wouldn't have flipped on the Covenant, at least not at this point. So, who won the war? It's hard to say for sure. Who dealt the killing blow? The Arbiter. Who made that blow possible? Cortana and the Chief and Truth. Who forced the Arbiter's hand? Truth. Who decided to flip and actually join humanity? The Arbiter. So it's a combination of all of these characters and all of these factors. And the Master Chief himself says that any one of his Spartans could have filled his boots and accomplished exactly what he did. But he was the one to do it, and as such, he became a living legend. And his legend continues to grow. While he was doing this, the other Spartans were off doing their own missions, many of which would have no real bearing on the end of the Human-Covenant War. So the Spartans as a whole can't be credited and saving humanity and winning the war when most of them weren't even there when the war ended, doing the things that needed to be done that set up the end of the war. And so to that end, the Master Chief can't take full credit for the ending of the war because he couldn't have done it without Cortana, without the elites, and without Truth's decision-making. And on that topic, it must be said that the Great Schism was going to happen anyway. Truth sort of always favored the Brutes for decades over the elites. And as we see in Broken Circle, the Great Schism was an inevitability. It would have happened at some point no matter what, but the Master Chief gave Truth the excuse he needed to usher in the change of the guard and kick off the schism. At the time that he did. And there is an argument to be made for whether or not humanity would have lasted to that point, would have lasted that long without the Spartans for the schism to ultimately end the Covenant. And my opinion to that answer is probably not. As we would discuss in the early to mid-war sections of the 20s and 30s, the Spartans' sole purpose was to slow the Covenant down. 600 Spartan threes died for the sole purpose of slowing the Covenant down. Without them, the Covenant's advance into human space could have been a lot quicker, more deadly, and they would have found Earth a lot sooner. So again, we come back to the question of, did Spartans win the war? In my opinion, no. It was a combination of people and aliens who sacrificed everything they had and went to places unknown to end the war together. But, and this is a big but, without the Spartans, humanity would have lost the war long, long ago. Their intelligence was used by all fighting the Covenant, as I mentioned in this video with Cole earlier on. Their missions prolonged the war and kept humanity in the fight for as long as it took, and one of their members was instrumental in ending the war, without which the series of events that ended the war couldn't have happened. So in conclusion, the Spartans spent 27 years fighting a war on two fronts. The war that mattered was against the Covenant, an alien conglomeration with that's sole purpose at that time was to end the human race, and through daring and costly missions, the Spartans gave humanity a fighting chance, while disrupting the Covenant at every turn, to the point that two separate elites broke from the Covenant in order to hunt them down. One I mentioned, Nizak Kavarosi, the other one being Zukazama-me. But when the war came to a close, one final effort from one Spartan, an AI, humanity, and elites ended the war, and each of them deserves credit. While the Spartans were invaluable to the war effort, saying that they alone won the war is a disservice to Jacob and Miranda Keyes, to Sergeant Johnson, to Stacker, to the Arbiter, to Urtos, to Sesa, and to dozens of other characters, thousands even of unnamed characters, and I think the Spartans themselves would agree. As the Master Chief says himself, being the best known doesn't mean being the best, and being credited as the winners of the war from someone like Parangoski or Halsey doesn't mean they actually did. So did the Spartans win the war? No. It was a huge collaborative effort between thousands of characters unnamed and a few named. Did the Spartans extend the war? Absolutely. And in that, you could say they did win the war in that way, expanding the war long enough to give us a chance to actually win it. That is credible. But for me, the Spartans didn't win the war, they extended the war. And many, many characters contributed to the end of the war. Giving that credit solely to one group is a disservice to them. But let me ask you what you think about it. As I talked about earlier in this video, I put a post in Patreon and in the Patreon-only section of my Discord, and I asked, do you think Spartans won the war? And so let's go over some of those replies. Donnie, my good friend Donnie, left a very, very short reply in no context. Won the war? No. Prolonged the war? Yes. Thanks, Donnie. Michael the Eagle Scout, another good friend of mine, a longtime patron member, said, I believe that Spartans helped save humanity, but the war wasn't won by humanity. The Covenant lost because of circumstances they set when they found Harvest and realized that they, humanity, were not Forerunner artifacts, but predecessors of the Forerunners for the mantle. In recent books and games, I believe it is important to realize that separating humans and Spartans is kind of deflecting the message of those stories, because Spartans may be super soldiers and go above and beyond of what an average human can do, but they are still human. But overall, without Spartans, humanity would have lasted months instead of years, and without Spartans now, the whole galaxy would be in the biggest civil war ever between all races and societies. So, the Human-Covenant War, Covenant lost to their own downfall. Human Civil War, prevented so far. Human intergalactic conflicts, 50-50, since those are going on constantly. There are some good points in that. Do I think humanity would have lasted months instead of years without the Spartans? Probably not. I think the Covenant invading Earth or invading human-controlled space, that would have taken years anyway, though the Spartans definitely extended that time. However, he's absolutely correct that without the Covenant tearing itself apart, humanity would have lost. The Great Schism really is the thing that ended the war. Over on Patreon, Trevor Palamuso says, I mean, yes and no. The Spartans were really the one true force on the ground that could effectively take the fight to the Covenant, but it would usually only temporarily extend the life of the planet. That's absolutely correct. So they still would have lost the war, even with how effective they were. But at the same time, without the Spartans, do you get the events of Halo CE and Halo the Flood on Alpha Halo? Because without those events, would the Great Schism happen? Because that was the event that truly turned the tide of the war. Without the elites, humanity loses the war. You're absolutely correct, and that's where we get into this hard balance of crediting one people over others. Without the Spartans, the Great Schism would have happened, we just don't know when it would have happened and if humanity could have survived that long. Ryan Torrance says, in a word, no. They prolonged humanity's survival, and they were really the only thing we had to take on the Covenant, but we didn't win the war. We survived it. If truth hadn't ousted the elites, humanity would have never survived. So there is that common theme here of humanity didn't win the war, we survived it. And you could say surviving and is winning the war, and you're right, but we're talking semantics here. And again, a lot of folks agree that crediting the Spartans with winning the war would be a disservice to the others. And so, with that, my conclusion is no. The Spartans didn't win the war. They prolonged the war. Thank you all so very much for watching. I would love to hear what your thoughts about this are in the comments below. I will be reading them diligently. I also want to point out here, in Patreon, I put the schedule for the rest of the year, what the videos are going to be about. And there are 3 in there, the next 3 videos that I'm going to make, that I am immensely excited for. Like, they're videos that are not like videos I've done before. And there's one of them that I think is probably going to be the most fun I've ever made, making a video. And so I'm so excited for it. I hope you're excited for it too. But thank you all so much for watching. This was a lot of fun to put together. A lot of research, a lot of pinning down where the Spartans were, at what time, and what they did, and if that actually helped the war effort. So, like I said, I've dialed in my camera more than I ever have. I need to work on lighting. So if you like the look of this video, let me know. If you don't, let me know as well, and I will, I'll look into it. Okay? Thank you all for watching. I love you all. You all have a wonderful day.